Hello and welcome to this episode of the Time for Impact podcast. This is a bit of an unusual episode in that it features the head of volunteering at the Science Museum Group and the leader of the Heritage and Volunteering Group, Matthew Hick. Now, Matt was so generous with his time and so insightful with his ideas that we decided we had so much material that we'll make this into two special episodes for you to enjoy. So here it is. We're going to now play you the first episode of the Time for Impact podcast with Matthew Hick. Okay, so welcome to another edition of the Time for Impact podcast with myself, Chris Wade, founder and managing director of Time for Impact, and my co-host, who can introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Matt Cobble, and I've worked in volunteer leadership now for the last 12 plus years.
And every time we have an edition, every edition, we try to invite somebody on who's going to really push the envelope in terms of creative, innovative and insightful thinking in volunteer management. And today is no exception. So our guest today is Matthew Hick from the Science Museum Group. Hi, Matt.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Matt. Nice to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast, and thank you for the great introduction.
So, Matt, maybe we start by just exploring a little bit about what you do, because you have two roles. You have obviously your head of volunteering role at the Science Museum Group, which I'm sure you'll tell us about, but also you are the founder, no less, of the Heritage Volunteering Group and the chairman of that too. So we'd love to hear a little about how that idea came about and how it came to fruition and what the inspiration was as well.
Well, thank you, Chris. Yes, more than happy to dive into both of those subjects for you. So I've been involved in volunteerism for 16, 17 years now. That's making me feel very old. I started as volunteer coordinator at the National Railway Museum and was given the opportunity really to transform volunteering there. So we went from a relatively small scale program with around 200 or 300 volunteers up to a program much larger than that, delivering kind of 40,000 hours worth of activity across a whole breadth of operations within the museum. And during that time, I also kind of built a really rich culture of volunteering engagement. And I often think back to my first volunteering event where it was just before I'd started at the museum, where I went to a meeting with some volunteers that the previous coordinator was running, and just listened to the volunteers rip the volunteering program and experience apart, to 6 years later, 7 years later, where we built up this culture of volunteering within the museum. Volunteers really felt a part of the organisation, of the wider workforce. And when we were facing really difficult financial times, similar to those we face today, our volunteers were there ready to help us, not only in terms of delivering activities, but in coming up with ideas. And it just, as I look back on that experience, we had a really supportive volunteering programme. So at that point, I was then essentially appointed head of volunteering for Science Museum Group, with a focus on taking what we'd done at the National Railway Museum and delivering those outcomes across Science Museum Group. So that was a really interesting 6 or 7 year journey that we've been on since then.
Just for our listeners, Matt, I wonder whether you want to tell us a bit about who or what is involved in the Science Museum Group, because I know there's five museums, but not everybody will know them all. So.
Absolutely. So we've got 6 sites across Science Museum Group. So National Railway Museum, where I'm based and where I was originally volunteer coordinator. We've then got the Science Museum in London, the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, Locomotion in County Durham, and then We've also got a site down in Swindon called the Science and Innovation Park. So it's a really great organisation to work for, really exciting and range of opportunities for volunteers to get involved in. So we've got volunteers supporting us perhaps in kind of what you might think as sort of traditional museum type roles like our information points, object handling, tour guiding, through to sort of collections based roles. So we've got volunteers who are helping sort of catalogue the collection, enhance our understanding of the collection, rebuild locomotives, would you believe, which is pretty awesome. Right the way through to kind of back of house roles, so administrative support roles. So I've got a couple of amazing volunteers who support me. One who kind of rebuilt all our intranet pages for volunteering, one who was an former RAF auditor and helped develop our auditing framework for volunteering, and the National Railway Museum's got a volunteer that sits on the senior leadership team there to give volunteers a voice in how the organisation is run, which is really impressive.
It sounds like that, Matt, you've got a really interesting mix of opportunities, and many of them involving people at quite a high skill base. Be interested in your approach to that. What's the kind of recipe for really bringing in people and using their skills? Some of them potentially sound quite niche and specialist. Is there anything we can learn around that?
Yeah, so I think it's maybe worth just kind of discussing the broader context around this first, actually, and the strategic journey we've been on, because during the first 4 or 5 years, certainly, of my role as head of volunteering, the focus was very much on operational involvement of volunteering. So yes, creating that culture of volunteering within our organisations, but bringing volunteers in to help us deliver more at a time when we had less resource. So it's absolutely operational focused. But since then, we've made a major strategic shift in terms of moving away from solely being operationally focused to thinking about how volunteers can have a strategic and social impact, how volunteering can have a strategic and social impact through the way that we develop and create roles. Now, in terms of how do we do work with very specialist groups. So, for example, chemistry cataloguing volunteers, or so there'll be scientists with specialist knowledge of chemical glassware collections. Would you believe? So, and for example, we work with specialist railway groups as well, who understand very, very specific aspects of railway history. So in those scenarios, what we're doing is we operate a devolved volunteer management system. So that means we have our volunteer managers at site level support what we call volunteer supervisors. So they're paid employees within Science Museum Group who then supervise specific teams of volunteers. So when we're creating roles, we will be working with the supervisor who will be completing what we call an activity outline. So this is a tool we use to not only kind of outline what the volunteer is going to be doing and when they're going to be doing it, but the partner organisations that we might want to work with, obviously the skills that we need, but also the budgets that are going to be assigned to the role, the equipment that's going to be needed, the training that's going to be needed to provide it. Not just the stuff that you're going to see on a role description, it's that planning that goes on before. And during that planning conversation, we would be talking to the supervisor about, okay, so you're looking at this specific role, chemical glassware collection, how are we going to attract people with the skills, who are we going to work with? And that's where partnership working comes in and becomes really important. And so we're then targeting those specific roles at a specific organisation, an audience, usually one which the supervisor will hand in with, who they will know people within that specific world.
So it sounds like a really exciting kind of really high level version of, I guess, a sort of that map that I've always worked to in volunteering, which is, be really clear about what you need people to do, what the skills are, what's involved in that, and all the background stuff to that as well. And then once you know that, you've got a much better idea of where you're going to go to find those people and how you're going to sort of hook them in potentially. It sounds like you're doing that kind of in a really in-depth way all across the area, but presumably it's working really well for you.
It is, yeah. I mean, what I would say is, so that happens because the curators and the archivists know those communities. Where we want to move to now as an organisation is to move away from that operational focus. So thinking about getting people in because they know about chemical glassware and helping us to do work. To thinking more broadly about how volunteering supports Science Museum Group's vision to inspire futures, to be open for all, to build science capital, and how then we can work with community partners to do that. So one of the ways that we do that is I have done for most of our sites what I call created this volunteering report. So what that looks at is the operational and strategic needs of each of our sites, and then the context within which we're developing our local volunteering programs. And that context bit is really important. So what I'm looking at there are things like city council, skills development plans, joint strategic needs assessments, all of those kind of policy documents that outline what are the priorities within our cities. And then within the report, what we're looking at is thinking about how do we align the priorities within our cities and communities with what we're trying to achieve operationally and strategically at Science Museum Group, and how then do we deliver that through partner organisations. So sitting behind that report and that information is a list of maybe 60 or 70 community partners that we can work with, especially in some of our bigger cities, and the demographic data of what our communities look like. And so what that means is that our volunteer managers are equipped to have far more detailed and informed conversations with our supervisors about the partners that they want to work with. So an example of some of the work that we're doing at the moment. So in Manchester, for example, so one of the priorities for Manchester, Greater Manchester, is bridging the digital skills divide. So helping people with low digital literacy levels up. So one of the ways that we're doing this is we are working with local community groups and colleges to provide young people with the opportunities to come in and volunteer alongside what we call our baby volunteers on Baby. Now, these are not very, very, very young volunteers. Baby was actually one of the first proper mainframe computers within the country. We've got a mock-up of that in the Science and Industry Museum. Our baby volunteers run that, and we get cohorts of young people coming in to volunteer with them, learn those skills, build their digital literacy levels, so that not only are we operating and looking after a really important item within the collection, but we're doing so in a way that also supports Manchester City Council's wider ambitions. And so what I often talk about is actually, and this is what I talk to our trustees about, is how volunteering helps us build socio-political capital. This idea that actually volunteering is much more about what we can do beyond our doors than it is about what we do operationally. And so by thinking about what we deliver, how we deliver that within the broader context of our local communities, we can really unlock the power of volunteering to transform organisations, to transform lives, and to transform communities. And what directors need to understand is that volunteering, yes, okay, you need to get work done, but actually if you're structuring these in the right ways, and you as a leader within your organisation understand that volunteering is meeting local community needs at scale, you can use that in conversations that you're having with local politicians to unlock doors around funding and all sorts of other important work and financial streams. And in doing so, really transform lives and communities. And so that's the journey that we're on across Science Museum Group. That's the work we're doing. There's lots of great work going on, as mentioned, in Manchester, up at Locomotion, which is in a place called Shildon, which is a really deprived community. We're doing a lot of wellbeing work. So we work with local mental health charities, local youth groups. We've got essentially a gardening project where our volunteers are looking after gardens on our site, gardens at the local station, so they can improve their well-being, support community cohesion. And actually, when we developed our volunteering strategy for Locomotion, we actually involved local politicians in the consultation process, so that they knew what we were doing, but they had an opportunity to feed into this and say, actually, do you know what's really important for the people in this area is X, Y, and Z, so that we can shape opportunities that meet those needs.
Thanks, Matt. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating, and I sense there's a lot more there than you're even telling us. And it made me reflect. The conversation I have all the time. Actually, it's probably one of the reasons why we called it Time for Impact. Of course, is that organizations and volunteering teams in particular really struggle to demonstrate the strategic value of volunteering to their leadership and to external funders, and you've touched on both of those. And clearly, what you're describing is social impact. But more than that, you're showing how you've managed to tie social impact as a value that is really important and tucked straight into the organizational missions of these organizations, and recognize it as a sort of strategic driver. That's quite a feat, I think, for an organization. I know you have local bases, but still the Science Museum Group is seen as quite a big organization. I imagine if you were a local heritage group, the opportunity to demonstrate that societal impact on the communities that you operate in should, in theory, be even greater. There should be a closer synergy, you would think, than there is for bigger organisations. And likewise for charities, it shouldn't be too difficult to demonstrate the impact that your volunteering has on your local communities. Yet time and time again, all I see is people counting volunteer hours. I wonder if you've got any advice for listeners who are heads of volunteering about how they can do more to capture and demonstrate evidence of that, or at least build a narrative, a convincing narrative to take the local politicians, your own CEO, and other potential funders on that journey. I mean, I do some of those work around balanced scorecards and things, but what's your experience been?
Yeah, so for me, first of all, I think it's important to understand and to look at volunteering and to measure the impact in a variety of different ways. And I am probably one of the few people that you will meet that think there is a value in recording volunteer hours and using them to influence. And I say that because if you go to Spain, there's no point speaking French to somebody. And what I mean by that is if you're speaking to the head of finance and all they want to hear is, how many volunteers have you got? And you can give them a big number that is going to open the door to get you more resource to deepen impact, then I'm willing to do that. I'm not going to say, no, sorry, I want to tell you about the well-being impact and speak to them in French. So
yeah.
I am one of the few people.
I've just written a blog about cultural intelligence, and I think that's an example of it.
Just to speak the language of the people that you're talking to. I think that's the thing. Absolutely. But looking at this more generally, I guess kind of what my thoughts on this, and we're doing some great work on this at Science Museum Group, because my executive, we have this ambition to become the sector's leading volunteer involving organisation. And our executive rightly challenged me on this and said, okay, so it's not about hours and numbers. How are we going to measure that, Matt? What does that mean? How do we know if we've achieved that? And that means kind of looking at things in a variety of different ways. And I'll talk about the work that we're doing on HVG with this. But what essentially I went away and did was essentially look at the value chain for impact. So I guess kind of what I mean by that is you've got your Science Museum Group vision here. So our vision to inspire futures, to become diverse and inclusive, build science capital, all of these things. And then you've got the next level down, which is the departmental strategies. And within that, we've got a strategic framework within the volunteering strategy. Then we've got deliverables, and what we need to measure are the deliverables that work backwards up that chain that ultimately link back to inspiring futures, unlocking science capital. And that means that we're recording and measuring a variety of different things. Now, some of those things we were measuring already, such as volunteer satisfaction scores, volunteer kind of well-being scores, and they come out of our satisfaction survey. What we've done this time is to look at some other areas, look at some data from time well spent, that aligns with our ambitions around Science Museum Group. So, give you an example, skills development. So, actually, there's data from time well spent around the number of people that say they've learned new skills as a result of volunteering. So, we can add a question into our satisfaction survey, benchmark that against the data in time well spent, and that will give us a metric to report against a key strategic outcome for Science Museum Group. So we do that. We also capture what we call verbatims in the satisfaction survey. So that gives us that richer picture of the impact that volunteers are having, and that's their feedback. So, and again, that's across a range of different areas that link back to areas of the value within the value chain. And I must say, I read some really moving ones today about the positive impact that volunteering has on people's well-being, and actually it was really moving. People talking about how they'd lost partners, and but as a result of volunteering with Science Museum Group, it literally transformed their lives. And that's why we do what we do, isn't it? To have that impact on people's lives. And so what I'm required to do at Science Museum Group is to write 2 reports. So one goes to government, so we're an arm's length body, so we're required to submit data. That's usually very stats heavy, and then we have the annual review, which is our glossy publication that goes out to the general public, and that's much more kind of narrative led. So what my job is to take all of that data and create this narrative that supports what we're trying to achieve at Science Museum Group. So in both those documents, we'll be talking about how we're inspiring futures, how are we transforming communities, how are we building science capital, and really pulling out those narratives, those quotes, the stats that we have. So that's our approach. We capture all that in a central document, and that then goes back to our directors at each of our sites, so that actually they can see that data, and they can then have those conversations with local politicians or local funders, depending on whatever team they're in. So actually, we're using that data not just to report, put it in reports that maybe not that many people will read, but actually to use that to further our ambitions around volunteering.
So Matt, you've talked a lot about kind of the sort of social impact of volunteering, and I think a lot of us as kind of leaders of volunteers are thinking, okay, how can we have more of a social impact? How can we reach more people? How can we bring more people that our organisation is not currently appealing to, into our organisations? I'd be interested on anything you've been working on or anything you've been sort of measuring in that area to understand how we're making sure, I guess, the social impact of our organisations is for everyone.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that's really important to Science Museum Group is being diverse and inclusive. And so, and the way that we talk about that is we talk about being open for all. So traditionally, our volunteer programs have been what you would expect from a volunteer program. So they've been comprised of volunteers who are wealthy, white, older, middle class, well-educated volunteers, CV builders. But actually what we want to do is we don't want to necessarily move away from that model, but we want to make our programs more diverse and equally ensure that they are inclusive spaces as well. And so the activities that we're doing around our volunteering strategies and working with community partners will drive that change. But of course, we need to measure that change as well. So there's a few things that we do in this area. So I suppose like a lot of organisations, we measure volunteer diversity, and we do that across a range of indicators that match up with what we do for Science Museum Group. And that allows us to compare volunteer demographics with employee demographics and combine them as well, which I think is also quite useful. So I'm sure there's lots of listeners are already measuring that, and we of course report on that. But one of the things that we do is we look at inclusion rates. So like a lot of organisations, we run an annual volunteer satisfaction survey that looks at the experience of our volunteers across a range of metrics, including things like, does volunteering improve your health and well-being? Are our volunteer programmes inclusive spaces? Would you recommend Science Museum Group as a great place to volunteer? So, and I'm sure a lot of people are doing similar things like that. However, what we also include within that survey are diversity monitoring questions. So the same questions that we ask as part of our diversity monitoring survey. And what this means is that when we come to analyse the data, we can look at those questions around, would you recommend Science Museum Group as a great place to volunteer? Is volunteering improve your health and well-being within different demographics? And this gives us a really good understanding of whether or not we're an inclusive organisation to volunteer with. And it's quite interesting because actually the minority groups often appear within our data sets to be having a greater experience than the dominant coalition, which I think is really interesting in and of itself. But that's a really great way of actually not just saying, are our programmes diverse, but also measuring whether or not they're inclusive spaces as well, because actually you could be recruiting people through community partners into the organisation, but if they're all having a terrible experience, then actually they're just going to leave, aren't they? And surely what we should be trying to do as leaders of volunteer engagement, as actually anybody working within an inclusive space, is to create inclusive places to volunteer. The other thing that we do is we measure socioeconomic status of our volunteers by using postcode data and the indices of multiple deprivation. So I don't know that people might not be aware of what the indices of multiple deprivation are, but they are basically the government breaks down the country into small areas and then measures within each of those small areas 7 different indicators relating to skills poverty, health poverty, income deprivation, and then each of those areas is scored, and then across the country all those areas are graded. So what we do at Science Museum Group is we take the postcode data of our volunteer, we then align that with the indices of multiple deprivation, and we're able to look at, for every one of our volunteers, where they live and where they fall on the deprivation score, and then we aggregate that data. So we, for example, could see actually the number of our volunteers living in percentile 1, which is a most deprived area of the country, right the way through to those living in the least deprived areas of the country. And then what we're able to do is look at that for the wider population level within our local community. So we can say, well, this is, we've got 10% of our volunteers are from the bottom 30% most deprived areas within York, and actually 20%, for argument's sake, of the population in York live in the bottom 30% of most deprived areas. So actually our programme isn't as representative of the community as we would like it to be. So we need to be focusing on those recruitment and engagement of people from that bottom 30%. It is more straightforward than it sounds, but it's a really great way of measuring socioeconomic status, of looking at if you're engaging people from poorer backgrounds in volunteering.
Probably worth saying, isn't it, Matt, that these data sets are available for organisations. These aren't sort of secret hidden things. These are things that are available sort of freely online.
So these are free. So there's 2 things that I guess you want to be looking at. Is one, the indices of multiple deprivation, and then the postcode checker. And I don't know whether you'll be providing links in the podcast, Chris, but you might want to provide those, and then people can. All you do is run the postcode data against the indices of multiple deprivation.
And if you're not an Excel wizard, find a volunteer who is, right?
Like absolutely. Absolutely.
The way forward.
I've done that on many occasions.
So, Matt, that's the end of part 1 of our conversations with Matt. Fascinating. I'm sure you agree. Absolutely full of gems and inspiration that I suggest we sum them up perhaps at the end of the part 2, so people have to listen to part 2 before we get into a little bit of a summary.
Yeah, my brain is already fizzing with so many interesting things that we should all be thinking about. So yeah, great episode. Tune in for the second part, where I'm sure there'll be some more fantastic insights and things that are challenging us all.
And if you want to suggest guests for future episodes, we're always really interested to hear of your suggestions, of anyone who's been really innovative and creative and who we can learn from. Please do drop us a line, and our email address is podcast@timeforimpact.co.uk, and we'd always love to hear your ideas, your suggestions, and indeed your feedback. And of course, please do subscribe so you can hear future episodes, and tell all your friends and colleagues about us, and hopefully they will enjoy the podcast too.
See you next time.
Bye.